name's Jeanette Pers, and it's going to be my pleasure to be facilitating and taking us through this webinar today, talking about or having a look at some of the tips around what we need to do to get published. So how to get that good work out there and to get it published. I would like to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the custodians of the lands on which we live and on the lands on which we are zooming in from today, and to pay our respects to elders past and present and those that will come into the future. It's also, as this is WHRTN, it's also important to take this time to note the Indigenous women who have been our mothers and our aunties and our sisters and our daughters, that have played such significant roles in raising communities and playing important roles in our communities. And we look forward to their collective wisdom and in guiding our work as we continue our partnership in improving the health outcomes for all women living in this land. So it's my pleasure to be able to introduce our panel today. This is a panel that has incredible experience in writing academic publications, but importantly, this is also a panel that have a lot of experience in editing for academic journals. And so it's often useful to hear what editors and reviewers think. And so that's really sort of the focus or the angle or the lens that we're going to be taking this and looking at this from today. As I've mentioned, my name's Jeanette Pers. I'm the Director of the Translational Health Research Institute at Western Sydney University, and I have the pleasure of working with this very experienced team of writers and editors. Professor Jane Usher is a Professor of Women's Health Psychology at Western Sydney University. She is also an incredibly prolific writer. She's written over 350 pieces of academic work, journal articles, chapters. She's written several books amongst that collection. So I think she knows a little bit about academic writing and how to get published. And she's mentored many, including many of us online today, on how to actually do that. She's also the editor-in-chief. I think that's a fancy enough title, but she's the editor-in-chief of Women's Reproductive Health, which is a Taylor and Francis journal, which is the official publication for the Society of Menstrual Cycle Research, but publishes very broadly across women's reproductive health. She's also the series editor of the Psychology in Women's book series. There are 39 publications or books in that series, so it's an extensive library of books that have published around women's health and women's psychology in particular. So I think you can see that she's very well position to actually be talking to us today around publishing. Alex Hawkey, Dr. Alex Hawkey, is known to WHRTN because she's a recipient of one of WHRTN's early career researcher awards. She's also an NHMRC Emerging Leader Fellow, and she is an associate editor of the journal Women's Reproductive Health. So Alex comes and has some unique perspectives that she can offer us in terms of publishing. And Dr. Rosalie Power is also at the Western Sydney University. She's a research fellow in the Translational Health Research Institute. She is the book editor, so she will talk to us about other forms of academic publishing. So she's a book editor for Women's Reproductive Health, and she's also the lead investigator on two significant grants. One of them is a WHRTN co-production grant, so she's leading one of the major co-production grants in sexual health and disability. And she's also recently been successful in leading a grant, an MRFF grant, building on that as well, so looking at sexual health and disability. So you're in a very we have a very good panel that is able to actually present to us today. But more importantly, they're going to be a panel that's going to be talking to us. So I'll just move my slides down to give you an idea of, oops, we've gone too far. So what we're going to be looking at today and what we're going to be talking about, and we're going to be doing this as a conversation. So I'm assuming that many of you here have published, have co-published, or are thinking about publishing. So you're all at different stages along that journey. So we're going to talk more about our experiences and some of the pitfalls, some of the tips, some of the questions we ask ourselves. And we'll look at these 5 different parts of the writing process. So the writing stage, where or choosing a journal to publish in, submitting a paper, how do you respond to the feedback? How do you respond to the reviewers? And then some of the bigger issues around the publishing process. So we'll talk about those, but we'll do that through a conversation. But we want you to join this conversation. So please use the Q&A function. So not the chat. So please use Q&A because it's just easier for us to actually see the questions come in as a panel. So please use Q&A and put your questions in there. Where are you experiencing the blocks or the challenges, or what are the questions you have about the broader publication process, or any experiences that you may have had? Maybe you've tried to publish something and you've got a nasty response from a reviewer, or you're not sure where to actually publish. So put your questions in the Q&A, please, and we'll go to those as often as we can. Because that's really where we want to be focusing. So it's on your questions, but please use the Q&A function. Now, just to remind us all that the session is being recorded. That's because I'm sure you're going to want to come back and watch this time and time again on the WHRTN YouTube channel. Doesn't that sound like something that should, that you should get a subscription for? So, but you don't have to because it's free. So the YouTube channel will have this recording up there, along with a whole range of other resources that have been published both in webinars and other forms through WHRTN. So please do go and have a look at the WHRTN Hub, and it will have links to that YouTube channel. And I'm going to ask you now, rather than at the very end, because I'm likely to forget, that at the end of this, you will receive a survey or an evaluation asking you for your feedback. And we really do want that honest feedback. We do work on improving these webinars as we go from one to the next. So please take a couple of minutes just to fill in that evaluation when it actually comes through. Okay. That all said, okay, I'm going to take that off the screen because it's us that you need to look at. And I'm going to start on that first part of the process, the writing stage. And as I flagged, Jane Usher has incredible experience in writing. She's written an enormous amount. But I'm sure I'm sure she doesn't just sit down and suddenly it appears. I'm sure, Jane, you have to ask yourself questions. You have to ask, what are those important questions that anyone should consider when they're thinking about sitting down to write a publication?
Thanks, Jeanette. And I see we've got one question coming forward in the chat. And I think what I'm going to say, and I'm going to invite Alex and Rosalie to chip in, possibly answer the question, but in a slightly roundabout way. So I think the first thing to do when you're thinking about a publication, the most important thing is to think, what's the story? What's the story you want to tell in this, whether it's a paper or a chapter, or if you're writing in very long form, a book, it's the same principle. And then think who the audience is. Who are you talking to? So who are you trying to persuade or inform by your story? And then think about who the authors are. Is this something you're doing on your own? Increasingly, most of us write in teams. So who are the key authors? And you need to engage them right at the beginning. Rosalie and Alex and Jeanette and myself do write a lot together, and we work together on what the story is. So don't engage your authors right at the end of the process. Bring them in at the beginning. And we know in terms of the ethics of our research, discussing who's going to have authorship is one of the things in the NHMRC guidelines for authorship. We should be talking about it throughout the research process. So there's different sorts of publications that we can write, and I'll just go over them because sometimes people are thinking, well, I want to get published, but I haven't necessarily got any data, or I'm at the beginning of a PhD process, or I'm in between studies, or I'm data collecting for the next year, but I still need to keep my publications up. So you can write review papers. So you can write a systematic review or a narrative review, or you can write a theoretical paper. You could write an observational paper. So someone wrote in a question in the chat about work related to a clinical improvement project. You could write a paper on that, which is actually a description of the project, or you might want to write a paper which is a more empirical paper about an evaluation of the project. It depends what stage you're at. So that leads us to the kind of segue to what most of us are writing is empirical papers. So we're drawing on data. So we're either writing a qualitative paper, quant paper, or a mixed methods paper. And it's very much in that sense, it's data driven. And I have to say, I've written all of these types of papers at different points. so I can comment on any of them. But I think when you're thinking about empirical papers, one of the things to think about is how big is your study, and do you want to, is it a study that you can get published in one paper? We sometimes do this with our studies, even if they're huge studies, we'll write what I'll call an overall paper, which might summarize the whole study succinctly. But you also might want to write up particular sections of a study, particularly if it's a mixed method study. So you've got to be careful about not salami slicing too much, so you're splitting your data up in piecemeal. But you can also have a body of work from a particular study, and that's something that we often do from our research. So I might pass on to Alex here to see if there's anything you wanted to add into that, Alex.
Yeah, and Alex, also a questions come in around, and both, you know, Alex and Rosalie, you've both had more recent experience at this, about taking that PhD thesis and how do you turn that into a journal article? So you might both have some ideas around that as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jeanette. I'll answer that question first around, you know, the challenge of translating a PhD thesis into an academic journal articles. And I think this speaks a little bit to what Jane was saying as well, about the importance of picking out from that PhD thesis, what are the key narratives, the key stories that you want to get out into the academic field, and how might you break those down in the most interesting ways. It might be that you do a chapter, you know, each chapter speaks to a different issue, or it might be that there's themes across the different chapters that speak to a different issue. So working with your mentors, your supervisors, your other colleagues to think, okay, what are the key stories in here, and how can I break those down into the most meaningful ways to come up with those topic areas for those different journal articles. And I think that talks to sort of another point that I've had in terms of my journey and where I'm up to as a researcher around being strategic about the different types of papers that we're writing. So one thing that I've learned in publishing with Jane is some of my most cited papers are not necessarily my longest, most theoretically in-depth, most provocative papers. Sometimes the papers that get the most citations are ones that are more, and I'm not saying write descriptive papers and don't write theoretical papers, but looking at the different types of data that you've got coming out of your thesis or your project and thinking, okay, strategically, what audience am I wanting to focus on with this particular topic, and what's the best format of creating a paper to answer that or to speak to the need of that community. So it might be that you, if you're a qualitative researcher like myself, that you might have a paper that's more snappy, that's got more sort of descriptive, qualitative, you know, a shorter paper that gets out there, and that really serves a purpose for the more medico people, your health promotion officers, people that might not necessarily have an in-depth understanding of complex gender theories or whatever it might be. So when you're thinking about those different narratives as well, link in what Jane was saying, think about the different forms that you might want to come up with to sharing those narratives in terms of different types of papers. And I know that Rosalie is going to talk to this a little bit as well, but one of my key learnings as well, and this links into what Jane was saying again, is the importance of clarity in your story. And Rosie's going to talk to this across the whole paper. But for me, as somebody who does publish, but also does a lot of reviewing of academic papers, the importance of a really strong introduction, I can't really stress that enough. Not in a way that what you're wanting to do is really synthesize those key papers out there in a way that tells a clear narrative, that really highlights the gaps in the research, and then that makes it obvious to both reviewers, but also other people reading your papers, what the key research questions are and how you're going to answer them. And I think if you've got that in your mind and you've worked that out with your team, that when you come to the reviewing process as somebody who you know edits papers, it's just such a breath of fresh air to be like, okay, I understand what this piece of work's doing. And I think the key thing here is really not making your reviewers, not making your audience work out what you're trying to do or what you're trying to you know, argue in your study. So really punchy introductions and being strategic with the different ranges of types of papers that you might want to write. So I'll hand over to you now, Rosalie, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, and Rosalie, you know, give us your experience in this space. But I think, you know, we've had it mentioned a couple of times now about collaborative writing, and if maybe you have any reflections upon how you've seen collaborative writing and when teams work and when they don't work.
Yeah, I think when I first started doing academic publications was really in my PhD, and I'd sort of just disappear and pop up at some point with a paper that I'd sort of drafted all on my own. And I've really learned in joining the team here at 3 how beneficial it is to work in a team. The papers are so much stronger and richer because of the collaborative effort that we do. I think a core part of that, though, is really planning, and Jane and Alex have spoken to that already. So really mapping out the story and being clear what it is that the paper is speaking to, and also within sections of the paper, so that that can be designated to particular people to focus on and think deeply about. One of the mantras that Jane has is do one thing at a time. And I find that that works really well when we're working in a team as well, because we can go in and really focus in on the bit that we're trying to write. We tend to do it, we use a phrase under exam conditions, which means we just give ourselves a fixed amount of time to do the writing, because writing, how long is a piece of string? You can stand forever and write nothing. Whereas if you give yourself a fixed period of time, then we can come back together as a team and see what's working and what's not. And sometimes we rework the story at that point, or we make revisions, or it gives us an opportunity to problem solve roadblocks that we might be having. So working in a team does take time, but you can put some parameters and confines around that really help you to be effective in a team and to really produce very strong papers.
Okay.
I think working in a team, sorry, Jeanette, one more thing. I think one more thing is just to make sure that somebody's got oversight of the paper as well. I think it's important to still have somebody that is seeing the direction that the paper is taking and making sure that everything's coming together in a cohesive way. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to throw this to everyone before we move on to sort of the next section. One of the questions has come in saying, you know, we've been talking about teams and how teams are great and how they're working, but what about that senior author who's sitting on the paper? Okay, I think I've been one of those people, maybe not the senior author, but I've sometimes been the person that people are waiting on. What are your ideas? How do you respond to this? How do you push them along a bit?
Well, I have to say, as a senior author, I'm always over the line, so I don't think I've had that experience, and I'm usually the senior author. I don't know, Alex and Rosalie might want to speak to that one more.
I just pick up on what Rosalie was saying in terms of setting out those expectations earlier in the piece as well. So when you're coming up with that plan and you're talking that over with other authors on the paper, really talking about, okay, what do we all have coming up? What might be working on in terms of coming up with the timeline, and then really sticking to that timeline. My other piece of advice would be, and this is a really small thing, but when you're sending out a document saying, hello everyone, I want you to review this, please can you do this? Always put a date on it and be generous with that. Don't give them 2 days, but say I'd be really preferable if I've got all feedback before the 2 weeks time, so that or a month's time, or whatever time frame you're working to, so that you're giving people parameters in their brain. If you're just sending it saying, can you review this, it's not going to get prioritized in their minds as well. So being strategic around the way that you're communicating with the other authors as well, I think is really important. So yeah, coming up with that plan and a time frame at the beginning that you all agree to, and then when you're sending things out for review, putting a date on it would be some of my tips.
Okay, great.
Chase up the senior author. If you've sent it to them and they haven't responded, it may have got lost in their inbox. So I think to chase up, chase them up.
Yeah, Jane, I'm just before we leave this section, there's a couple of questions that have come in about, like, where do you start? Like if you're early in your PhD and you haven't yet got any data, and it's sort of related to what people often do at this stage is as a systematic review. You spoke about there being different types of publications, do you want to, have you got any thoughts about that for the person who's at the very beginning and not knowing where to start with their first publication?
Well, I think one of the things I'd say is write early and write often. So it's really important to start writing at the beginning of your PhD and start publishing as early as you can, because the whole process of sending papers off and getting review comments back is really the centre of what we do as academics, as researchers. And many people leave that process till after their PhD, not so much nowadays as they used to, and then are really traumatised by their first lot of reviewers' comments. I have to say that was my experience, because I didn't publish till after my PhD, and when the first lot of critical comments come in, you're devastated by it. So it's good to get used to it early. And it's also, as a PhD student, it's incredibly good to get feedback on your work while you're doing it, because you can incorporate that into your thesis. And I know both Alex and Rosalie did that. So I'd say for the person who's, you know, wanting to start, you can actually, you can publish a systematic review. You can publish a theoretical paper in your area. You can publish a critique in your area if you haven't got data yet. So they're the sorts of things to do. And a lot of PhDs now build in a systematic review as part of it. And someone's asked a question about, do you need ethics approval for a systematic review? And no, you don't. So that would be what I would say in terms of your PhD. Do you want me to address the other questions, Jeanette, or do you want to?
No, we might come back to that, because some of those are bigger things that we can capture. But I'll move us on now. I'll move us on to the next stage. Let's say you've written your publication, okay, or you're pretty close to finishing it. So you, where do you, or how, and this, I'm going to ask this to the whole panel. This is about where to publish. How do you decide which journal to send a paper to? And do you decide that before or after you've started the writing process, or what are some of the considerations you should be thinking about?
Where to publish? I suppose I would say, I think this is an important one. And I know early on in my career, I didn't have an idea of where to publish. And I think it's something people often, you kind of know when you've been doing it a long time. And I think when you're coming into a field, it can be quite difficult. I think it's really goes back to the question of who's your audience. And you might want to, with a particular study, have different audiences. So, for example, we've just been involved in, all of us involved in a study on looking at LGBTQI cancer. So some of our research, we want to aim at cancer clinicians. That's one of our primary audiences. So we publish a lot of our research in cancer journals because we want to get to those cancer clinicians. So depending on what area of women's health you're in, you're probably going to want to talk to those people who are working in the field. But sometimes you might want to talk to other researchers. So we publish some of our papers in sexuality journals because we're talking to sex researchers and we're interacting in that field. Sometimes you might want to have something which is more discipline based, like a critical health psychology journal or sociology journal. So I think it's partly audience. It depends on whether you're going for journals that have got high rankings, like a Q1 journal. And I know some universities, particularly for academics, insist that they only publish in Q1 journals. But there can also be other journals that are more specialised, that aren't necessarily Q1 or high impact factor, that you actually want to publish in. And that can also be a good thing to do when you're early in your career, because sometimes it's really hard to get into the Q1 journals. So I'm not saying it's necessarily easy to get into the other journals, but that can be another reason for choosing where to publish. I think also paper length. As Alex alluded to, in our team, we tend to write quite long papers because we're either doing mixed methods or qualitative papers. So sometimes it's journals that will actually take a long paper that we're looking at. We also have a system within our library, which many universities do now, where we can get free open access because of subscriptions our university has. And so we actually had gone through this process this week with a paper we're just about to send off, where we're looking at a cancer journal that had free open access and was Q1, and we've actually found one. So I think those sorts of criteria. I don't know if I've said it too much there, Alex and Rosie, to give you guys something.
You can also use the journal. Sorry, Alex, I'm not picking up the cues here. You can also use a journal finder. So when you know the subject or the focus of your paper, or even if you've written your abstract, can be a good time. You can put that in and it'll come back with some recommendations, and you can use that as a starting point to then go to the journal websites and see what their aims and scopes are, what else that they've published in that area, who their readership is, and whether that's going to be relevant to you. So,
I was just going to say, just to add to that, I tend to think about early on in the piece about where I'd like the article to be published, because that really shapes not only word count, but it gives you an idea of what form you're going to have to make that argument in, whether you've got the capacity to be able to link in theory and write a bit more luxuriously, or whether it's going to need to be a punchy piece. So having an idea early on in the piece, I think, is really important. We use, what's that called, Jane? Is it Schmago or Science Margo? I think we can share the
Schmago, yeah.
Schmago. We can share the link for this, and this is a resource that was shared with me early on in my candidature by Jane. And that basically means that you can put in a journal title, and then it comes up with, or some keywords, and it comes up with key journals reflecting those keywords, and it quickly gives you an oversight of that journal, so that it's ranking, it's whether it's Q1, 2, or 3. And I think that's really helpful. I save that in my book, on my book tab, so that anytime I want to think, well, what about this journal, I can quickly look it up and see how it ranks. And I think that's important in terms of balancing the expectations of you from your university in terms of whether Q1, but as Jane said as well, also balancing that with what audience you're wanting to attract in terms with your research. So not always having to go for the best journals, but going for the best fit, I think is really important. And one more thing to add to what Rosalie was saying, when you're looking for particular journals, I always go in and say I'm writing a paper on contraception. I'll look at both the aims and the scopes of the journal, but then also look at similar papers that have been written on that topic to sort of get a sense of style around how they might accept a paper. So I put in contraception and then look at the qualitative papers that have been written around contraception in that journal. That gives you an idea of whether you're likely to be a good fit, or whether or not you might be wanting to look for a different journal. So those would be my tips.
Yeah, it's also good to have a look at who you're citing in your paper. So having a look at where they have actually published, what were those journals, but doing your homework on the journal that you're going to submit it to is important. Are you writing in a style or a theoretical lens or a methodological lens that fits the scope and the aims of that particular journal? So the titles of a journal can sometimes be misleading. Don't just think, oh, I'm writing a cancer paper, any cancer journal will do. You actually do need to do your homework on the journal to make sure that it's actually appropriate for where you're sending it. So what about submitting a paper, okay, that whole submission process? Jane, as an editor, you're the first point of call when a paper comes in through these automated systems, but what are your views on pre-submission inquiries?
I do get a few, but not that many. I don't tend to make them myself. I think mainly if I get pre-submission inquiries, is this the sort of paper that your journal would want? And I generally say yes, if it's in the broad ballpark. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. I think basically we go through a process of desk review as an editorial team, which I think most journals do. We don't send everything out for review. So it's if we don't think it's appropriate for the journal, it will get knocked back pretty quickly. So that in a way acts as a kind of pre-submission inquiry. You've just been through the submission process. It means you've formatted it for a particular journal, but as long as you're using a referencing system like EndNote or RefWorks, you can change the referencing system for a different journal. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. I just want to speak to one of the questions that's come in, and it kind of, I don't know if it can segue into your question, Jeanette, about the approximate time frame for writing a journal article. We actually probably spend quite a long time on papers, which you might be surprised if you look at how many we publish in a year, which is a lot. But I think it's actually making sure you're sending something off when it's ready for publication. And I'd say we get a lot of submissions to the Journal of Women's Reproductive Health that I think could have been worked up more. If your paper has got grammatical problems in it, if you've got proof errors in it, if the references aren't the right format for a journal, it's more likely to get knocked back. And it also really irritates reviewers. So I think don't send a paper off for a review to a journal until it's ready for publication, and give it enough time. And the paper that we're about to submit, I think Rosie's going to submit later on today, I think we've been working on for about 4 years actually, but not constantly. So I don't want to make you all depressed, but it's a particular paper from a big study, and it's actually the first paper we started on, and it's going to be one of the last papers that we finish. But I would say a few months on a paper generally. But then, that's because if you count that as actually working on the analysis of the data, as well as the writing of the paper. If you're writing a very short descriptive paper, it might be slightly quicker. And it depends whether you're working full time on it or whether you've got other responsibilities, which most of us have. So I think it's a bit of how long is a piece of string question.
So Rosalie, James just outed you as, going straight to, submitting a paper after this webinar's over. So what are some of the things in the process of submission that you make sure you always do? And Alex, I'm sure you've got some things that you make sure you always do as part of the submission process.
This is such a fun part of publishing, and I'm trying to think of a good metaphor, but I think it outs all my sort of peculiar interests. It's kind of like wrapping a paper, a present really nicely, or polishing a bench or something like that. You get to really tidy up your paper. So make sure you get familiar with the author guides for that specific journal. They will have very specific requirements for how you format your document. So all your headings need to be in the right format. Your references and spaces need to be in the right format, your margins and font. All of those things make a big difference to how professional your article looks, and whether at a first glance the journal think that you're a reputable person to be submitting. If it's hodgepodge and all over the place, it's sort of a big red flag already that there might be some integrity issues with your paper. I like to also, you've often spent quite a lot of time working and editing and revising your article. I like to just take a really deep breath and take a little break for a minute, and then come back and do a final sanity read when I think everything is completely done, and make sure that there's no odd spelling or grammatical errors. There's lots of weird things that you miss when you get really familiar with your article that you just don't see. A double check for double references as well. If you're using a reference manager, sometimes there's just weird things that happen. So make sure that they're not put in twice and you're repeating the same reference. It's that really fine level of detail stuff to really polish up your paper. You also need approval from all the authors. So make sure that you've sent around the final version to everybody to sign off on. Those are probably the things that there's lots of steps involved in that submission phase, but really enjoying that last part because you're about to pass it off into the big world. So it's a really exciting time for a little article.
Yeah. Alex, what about you? What are some of the things that you make sure you always do in this submission process?
Yeah, I think just to add to Rosalie's point, the first one is around, as someone who looks at papers and just to find reviewers for them, actually just really talking to that point of the importance of not only the quality of your work, but also that it looks like a polished piece of work. If you're sending out a sort of ragged, unpolished piece, people aren't going to want to review that, so it's going to really hold up that process, or B, they're less likely to give you good reviews if they're having to try and work things out, or that it's not looking really clean and polished. To the journal, we get a lot of submissions of articles that don't use a referencing software, and I'm sure everybody here does, but absolutely get your head around a referencing software because that helps with consistency of referencing and things like that. So making that polishing process a lot quicker. I think the other thing is the importance of your letter to your editor as well, and not just copying and pasting your abstract into that letter, really speaking to that editor and trying to say, look, this is a really novel piece of work, and this is what I'm contributing that doesn't exist, and this is how I'm doing it. So really that helps to say, look, this is a good piece of research, and you want this to be in your journal, not that you had this many people in your study. Those sort of methodological things aren't as important. So don't repeat your abstract when you're sending in through your letter to the editor as well. So key things is really making sure you follow those guidelines, have it really as polished as you can get, take that time to do that proofread, that final read, don't flick it in, because you're tired of looking at it. As Rosalie said, take a quick break and come back to it with a fresh set of eyes. And it just makes that whole reviewing process and, just a whole lot better and a lot more likely to be favourable to the editorial team.
Okay, so if you do all of those things, sorry, Jane.
I was just going to say, I can't really stress that more strongly, and I'm actually in the process of doing revisions on a paper at the moment, which I will hopefully finish this afternoon. And the revisions I'm doing are to my EndNote referencing library, which has got some discrepancies in terms of capital letters in the titles of the papers, and which the editor of the journal has picked up on. And I'm going through this really methodical process of checking each reference in the paper and making sure it's correct. which I actually quite like doing because it gives me right boundaries around a piece of work, and I know I'll finish it this afternoon. But it's really that dotting the I's and crossing the T's you really need to give the time for in publication. And I think sometimes people have a fantasy, well, I've seen it with PhD students, that they just kind of sit at their desk, or they think this is what academics do. And it sort of speaks to the question in the chat that we haven't, that's still live, that maybe we can slightly speak to there. About the process of revising and revising and revising a paper. And someone in the chat has talked about, working on a paper for they're feeling stressed because they've been asked to keep revising the manuscript. I would say we're very experienced writers, and I've published hundreds of papers and nearly 10 books, and I would still say the papers that we write get revised multiple times. And it's, Rosalie's already spoken to this. So I think the process you're going through as a PhD student is a normal part of academia. And I can see how it can feel stressful, particularly if your notion is that, the likes of us sit down and a paper just kind of flows out of us. And what you see on the printed page is what we started with. It's really not the case. You have to go through that planning and reading and rereading. And if you're working with a team, and you are as a PhD student with your supervisors, taking their feedback on board and really patiently going through it. And I think particularly if you're early in your career and you've got the incredible luck of having someone who's reading your work and giving you constructive comments, take that feedback on board and let go of your ego and really learn from those who know how to do it. And I would have given my right arm to have had it when I was, early on in my career, and I didn't have it because I was just in a different system. So I think it can be frustrating when you think what you produced is perfect and your supervisors or colleagues are saying, no, you need to do this or that. But I'd say I now work very much collaboratively, and I really welcome the critical comment from Rosalie and Alex and Jeanette when we're working on a paper. And I would say what we come up with together at the end is so much better than what I would ever have written on my own. So I think if you can let yourself go into that process, and actually learn from those working with you, and that might be people who are, your colleagues as well as people senior to you, then I think you'll produce a much better paper.
So Jane, I think what yourself and Alex and Rosalie have sort of picked up on is that this is a long and it's a process. There's lots of steps in this, and everything from the getting the writing and going through the revisions and the revisions in the writing down to the mechanical task of actually uploading a paper. And Rosalie sort of took us through some of those steps that are involved in that mechanical process. And you illustrated too, Jane, the difference, making sure your capitals are right in your titles and stuff. Like, these are the mechanical things, but they're still really important. When you look at a paper that's published, it looks like, oh, that's perfect. Okay. But there's so many steps that have gone into that. And you've spoken, Jane, about getting feedback from your other co-writers or colleagues or your peers. But what about when the first feedback or some of the feedback you get is actually coming from a reviewer? Okay. So what do you do when you've gone through that process, you've had that moment of euphoria that Rosalie has described when she's going to hit the button and press go, and then at some point later, a couple of weeks, couple of months later, you suddenly get the reviewer's comments, okay? What are some of the best ways of responding and reacting to reviewers' comments?
Well, I'll just talk briefly and I'll let Rosalie and Alex. I think the first thing is to read the comments, feel really cross or upset, and then put the paper away and let it sit for usually a day at least, and then come back to it. And I just then go through it really methodically. And I start at the beginning of, I just print it. I've been doing actually this week, that we've had 2 lots of reviewers' comments to respond to in the last week, which is fabulous. I just copy the reviewers' comments into a new document, into a Word file, and then I go through the reviewers' comments systematically, addressing each one in turn and giving incredible detail about what I've done. So I speak to the comment and say, on page 5, I have done blah, 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 and I describe what I've done, and then I copy the text in that I've made the reviewer's comment in. So it means one of the frustrating things as an editor, and both Rosalie and Alex have this experience because I also act as associate editors on the journal we work on, is when people just say, I've done this, and then you've got to be the detective and you've got to go into the paper and find it. So normally journals want you to do track changes to show where the change is, but you also want to have a very detailed letter to the reviewer and the editor saying, this is what I've done. And I just go through it methodically, and it's a positive process generally, because if you do what the reviewers say, you get the paper published. I don't tend to argue with reviewers personally, but if you can sometimes get conflicting reviewers, and Alex might want to speak to this, because I think Alex's first PhD paper had, was it 9 reviewer comments, Alex?
7, not quite.
Oh, 7. Still a lot.
So I think, so did you want me to go, Jane?
No, you go, Alex.
I think as Jane said, the very first paper I published was a big learning curve for me, but quite a good one, because it sort of got better from there. I haven't had 7 again, but I think the first thing is to be really mindful of the tone of what you're responding to the comments in as well. So as Jane said, you can be quite angry, you can disagree, you can have all those feelings, that's fine, but don't bring those to the review. So sit on them and then come back with a fresh mind. And actually, once you start to get into it, you get momentum, and then you just, as Jane said, you just get through it in a sort of methodological way. But yeah, my top key point would be about being really careful around the tone. So don't come across as argumentative, don't come across as defensive. Quite often people thank the reviewer for their time when they're starting off the review, and just address the comments in a way that's just saying, yes, I've done this, or no, I haven't. With discussion of the team, we've decided not to do this, and tell the reviewer why, and just do that in a sort of a pragmatic way. You don't need to go off on big tangents, and you don't need to be aggressive. So and I think that's really important, because as someone who's actually had those quite aggressive comments come back, it really turns you off a little bit in terms of that review process. And so just being really careful with the tone that you're bringing to those comments, I think. And as Jane said, my other big piece of advice is give as much detail as possible in that review letter, because you don't want to make your reviewer go back and forward trying to find where you've made those changes. And it also means what I do when I get a review that's been addressed, that I've produced, I come in and I read that whole letter back, and then I go back and see those changes in context of the bigger manuscript. So if you can make sense of all of those changes in one big document, rather than saying I've addressed this, and nothing more, then that really helps with that clarity of that review process for the reviewer as well. Rosalie, did you want to add to that?
I don't really have anything to add, to be honest. Just as an associate editor, when we're trying to process through reviews, it's really difficult if I've got to then go searching through the manuscript. If somebody's just written done, I don't know what that means in response to a reviewer comment, and so it just really holds the process up. I've now got to clear a couple of hours to be able to process that response to the review. So the more helpful and detailed that you can be in replying to the reviewer, the better it is for everybody. And I think it's a really amazing opportunity to have a peer read your work and respond to it and provide feedback to you based on what they've experienced of your work. And it ideally will mean that your work is accessible to a broader audience, because you've now got another perspective that's informing it. So I think if you can get that frustration out of the way of the person not seeing it in the way that you intended, and whether you agree with them or not, it is a positive process to go through.
Yeah, and I think, Alex's point about tone is really important. And also, you may not always agree with what your reviewer has said, but one of the things I often think is, some things you just let go through to the wicket keeper. Like you may not agree with it, but is it really harming you to make that change? And so sometimes the course of least resistance and making the change is actually preferable than starting to engage in having a process where you're challenging a reviewer's comments. That said, there are times when you do want to challenge a reviewer's comments, but in most instances, the feedback they're giving you probably is making for a better paper. Let's look at other forms of Yeah, Jane?
Just to add to that, I have to say, personally, when I think it's rare in terms of my own publications that I've challenged the reviewer. I've mostly agreed with them, but there have been times when I have challenged them. Just as one example, sending qualitative papers in with thematic analysis, and a reviewer asking for a content analysis, a statistical content analysis, and just a particular case when I can think of that happened. And the editor, I think, being happy with my response, but it going back to the reviewer who wasn't, who kept insisting that we did a statistical content analysis. And so the editor actually was encouraged. I mean, it was fine in the end. It's a good outcome story, but I had to spend quite a lot of time really justifying why thematic analysis didn't involve content analysis. And I think it was going to, I don't know, I'm just making up, I won't make assumptions about what sort of person it was going to, but I think sometimes that was a case where I wasn't going to quantify a thematic analysis. I really didn't agree with what the review was saying. So I had to put quite a lot of energy into it. But otherwise, I would agree with Jeanette. Mostly the reviewer comments, I have to say, are good. And I would generally say that following the reviewer comments, the papers are usually better. And often people pick up nitpicky things that I haven't seen myself. And I think, how on earth did I let that through? So, and we're very, very nitpicky with our papers.
Jeanette, can I add one point to that as well?
Yeah, of course.
I think, and this depends on the audience, I think it's really important to get experience yourself in providing reviews as well. So if you are an ECR, working with your mentor, working with your supervisors and asking for opportunities. So they might have as academics, you get so many reviews coming in, there's no way that you could possibly answer all of those. But maybe that's something that you could get your supervisor or other, mentor to, if you haven't had the opportunity to learn how to give good reviews yourself. And I think that gives you a different perspective when your reviews come in as well. So if you haven't had the opportunity yet, try and find somebody who will mentor you in that process or is happy to share a review process with you so that you can learn the other side of providing the reviews as well. I think that's really helpful, and to do that early in your career as well.
That's a great point, Alex. So going to your supervisors who are going to have more reviews than they can deal with and say, can I shadow you? Can I work with you? Can I help you in doing a review? Sorry, Jane.
Well, I was going to say, for those people who might think, well, how do I get to do a review? I think Jeanette's making a suggestion you might take some of your supervisors. Otherwise, if you want, we're always looking for reviewers for women's reproductive health. So email myself or email Jeanette, and just let me know that you want to be a reviewer, and I'll put you on our reviewer list. And we really do encourage ECRs and PhD students to be doing reviews, and it's an incredible experience it really helps you in seeing what's a good and not such a good paper. And I think one of the comments in the Q&A is about papers with lots of grammatical errors, and it's not up to the reviewers to pick out all of those errors, but the reviewers can say to the journal, to the editor, look, these need to be corrected.
Okay, I'm going to move us on to make sure we just cover a couple of other things about the broader writing and the publication process. So I want to just touch with you first, Rosalie. As the book editor, are there other ways of publishing, academic publishing, and are there advantages to doing other forms of publishing?
Yeah, absolutely. So journals, depending on the journal, they often accept or they will accept book and media reviews. So at Women's Reproductive Health, we encourage people to get in touch with us about a text that they'd be interested in reviewing. And they can write a critique of that. Writing is a learned skill. So the more practice and experience you can get, the better that is for you. So book and media reviews are a really good way of doing that, as well as building your publication experience. It also helps you to build disciplinary knowledge. So you can find sort of a new text that's hot off the press, and we can help you facilitate access to that, and you can write a critical review about it. It's a really exciting way to keep sort of ahead of the game with literature. There's a few things to keep in mind though when you're writing a book or a media review. You want to be really careful that you're not just summarizing the contents of that material. So you do really need to provide a critical review or a constructive critique of that, and bring your own perspective and voice into it. So it's a really nice way of learning how to build your voice into a publication. We've got some guidelines that we send out to book or media reviewers to help them with the review, with writing their reviews, and also with ECRs. I tend to work with that person if they're needing to work up the review, to get out of that sort of summary state into a more critical reflection. I'm not sure if there's more you want me to say about that, Jeanette.
No, I think that's good. And I think it's, as you say, it's a good way of people finding their voice, but also, getting some experience in going through the publication process without having a piece of their own work that they're actually publishing on. And that was one of our earlier questions, was where do you start? Well, maybe you start by actually writing a commentary or writing a book review is a good way of doing it. Jane, in a couple of minutes that we've got left, I'd like you and all of our panel to maybe comment on the role of special editions and how people can get involved with special editions and what opportunities they may give for starting out writers.
Okay, well, people may know journals often have a special edition where you bring together a collection of papers. You can approach a journal and suggest an idea for a special edition if you're working in an area and you feel there's a gap, there's a need for that. I think if you're an ECR, or definitely if you're a PhD student, you'd need to do that with some senior colleagues. But that can be a really collaborative way. And I think one of the questions that came in early on, which we haven't talked about, is advice for forming collaborations and publication networks as an ECR. So putting together a special edition is actually a very good way of doing that. We're actually at the moment, we're going to have a special edition of our journal on disability and also on endometriosis coming up. We've previously had one quite recently on trans, sexual and reproductive health. So if you've got an area that you're working in and you think, okay, there's a body of work here, I know there's a number of colleagues internationally working across this area, then that's something that you can do. But you really need to be working with more senior colleagues, I think, to be doing that rather than doing it just on your own as an ECR. I don't know, Jeanette, is it a good point here just to segue into that question as well about collaborations and publication networks? Because I think
it is. Yeah, absolutely.
If I just comment on that, and then Alex and Rosalie, who are both also, or who are very networked, might want to talk about that. I think it can be very daunting starting out collaborations and networks. And I suppose when I was many years ago, when I was starting out myself, I did a lot of it through conferencing. So actually going to conferences and meeting people and actually just going up and talking to them, seeing someone's paper that I really liked, them coming up and talking to me and me talking to them and making a connection with them. And that's happened to, Jeanette and myself when we've been at conferences more recently as senior people. We get junior people coming up to us. And in fact, one of them's that we met at a conference in the US last year is coming to work with Rosalie at Western Sydney, I think, arriving this week from US, who's an ECR. So, that was someone who literally came up to us and said they really liked our work, told us about what they were doing. Over drinks, then we connected, we were chatting to them, and then they're now coming and working within our team. So I think being confident in going up to people is a good thing to do. If your supervisor's at conferences with you, they will hopefully introduce you to people. And you can also, get involved in your supervisor's networks. So if you're working on a project, they might say, oh, you should contact so-and-so. And it's much easier sometimes if you've got that connection through your supervisor because they know the academic colleagues. So ask your supervisor about that. I think you can also write to people. I quite often have collaborations with people that I've never physically met. And sometimes I've never even had, these days we'd have a Zoom, but historically you wouldn't even have a Zoom meeting with. So it might be somebody who's written to me, we've made some sort of connection and we might work on something together. So it sort of happens it's almost like a spider web. It happens in different ways. And as your career goes on, it can be very much a snowballing thing. You make more and more connections. And I think also you can make some really incredibly good friendships out of it. So we have many people who come internationally and come and have lunch in our house or stay in our house sometimes. And you can make lifelong friendships out of these connections and collaborations. So it's not just about, publish or perish. It's about connecting with people who have got excitement or interest in a similar field to you. And I often think as academics, we're just so privileged that we have this sort of international web of people that we know that you meet at conferences often or through other gatherings. I know Alex and Rosie, you might want to talk about that in terms of your connections.
Just briefly to add to what you were saying, Jane, around networking, also being memberships of associations. So, for example, the Society for Menstrual Cycle Research, we're all on the board, and through that, society that you get access to listservs, so you can put out calls for people who might be interested. You can put out calls for people who might want to collaborate. You can put out calls for, you know, things that you might need help on, or to boost your writing and those sorts of things. So as an ECR, I think really getting involved in different networks, whether that's, you know, general networks around ECRs or general networks around the type of critical health psychology or whatever it might be, or topic areas as well. So really putting your feelers out to see if there are networks that have listservs or membership that you can access. I think that's really important. And also working together as ECRs, and I think most of us are women on this call as well, so really working together. Can you publish things with other people that might be ECRs that are interested, and then working together to find a mentor that might oversee that, but using the resources that are around you as well, whether you've got other colleagues that might be working in a similar area, because you're in a similar place, you're both wanting to get publications out, you're both wanting to start to build that track record. So looking at your ECR networks as well, I think is really important.
And Rosalie, last words from you?
Oh dear, I'm not going to end on a strong one. I don't know. I think we've sort of covered it all, to be honest. I find it a bit nerve-wracking going up to people cold, but I am often genuinely interested in the work that they're doing. So from that sort of like genuine interest, it kind of makes it easier to talk to people. I've had some really good experiences where I've heard of people doing really cool work, and so I've emailed them and said, oh, I'm working on this and I'd be really interested to hear about your work. Would you be interested to have a Zoom with me? And then we've had a Zoom and shared what each other are doing, and we've moved on to work on projects collaboratively, or there's been various things unfold from that. So I think just using your interest and seizing the day to connect with people in a genuine way, I think is important.
Okay, well, thank you to all of our panelists. I've just put up on screen
Can I
the journal that we've made reference to. Yes, Jane?
I just wanted to say just something as a positive for people. I think I've got all these little sayings that I say that Rosalie and Alex know very well, including one thing at a time. I think one of my other little sayings is it's a marathon, not a sprint. If you're at the beginning of your career, unless you're in your mid-60s at the beginning of your career, you've got a long career ahead of you. And so pace yourself, take your time, and plan things out. So plan things out in terms of your, you know, what you'd like to publish in the next year. So think about it and have that plan and work through it methodically. But also, you're not going to get all of those publications done immediately. So it really is about pacing yourself and taking your time. And you know what you'll find when you look back in 5 years, 15 years, or 35 years in my case, that you've got a huge number of publications, but you didn't write all of those at once. You've just done them one at a time. So think about it one step at a time, because there is a lot of pressure to publish, but you really need to just to work your way through it.
Thank you, Jane. I think that wraps it up, and it's a nice way to end by showing that this is actually a long race that we're in. Thank you to our panelists, our expert panelists. I hope everyone has been able to get a little bit of a tip or an understanding from this. Linda has put emails for Jane and myself in the chat, but you will also find Alex and Rosalie, and I'm sure they'll be happy to engage with any of you who might want to have a more personal chat about their experiences. So please do reach out to any of us. And I've also put, just to highlight Jane's email there as the editor for Women's Reproductive Health. If you are interested in becoming a reviewer, if you don't feel you could ask your supervisor or it's not appropriate, but you would be interested in becoming a reviewer, please contact Jane and we'll find a way of actually making that a possibility for you going forward. This webinar has been brought to you by WHRTN and will be posted on the YouTube channel by May 31. Thank you, everybody. I hope you've got something out of this, and please do reach out to us. Let's create a women's network in the same way that boys have a boys network. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jeanette.